Welcome to
Urban Beginnings.
a podcast about navigating urban planning and its impact on community. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Urban Beginnings podcast. Today, we're joined with Enoc Mendoza, a transportation planner from Kern County. Enoch, can you give us a brief introduction for our listeners, please?
Yeah, how you doing,
All right.
everybody? Enoc Mendoza. I work for Kern County. I'm a transportation planner. Been doing this relatively short time, but in planning field, going on about 4 years now.
Very cool. And Enoch, we just really want to just get the conversation going for anyone, really, for you, Blair, as well. Like, what does transportation planning mean to you guys?
So for me, transportation planning, unbeknownst to me, it's kind of a three-pronged tier. Approach. You have your scheduling, you have your fleet management, and then you have your administrative. So far, being new to it, scheduling is probably the most difficult, but I do specifically fleet, sorry, um, and new vehicle acquisition, and now focusing on zero emission vehicles. Um, and pretty much that's what I enjoy. I think out of all three facets for us.
For sure. Um, that's kind of like high level. I recently went to, or sorry, not high level, but that's kind of, I guess, a element of, part of transportation planning. I recently was at Bakersfield Community College at a redlining Bakersfield event hosted by Donato and Chris. We right after their presentation, well, actually during their presentation, they mentioned I was an urban planner, and the room was full of kids or students. And they, after the presentation, a few students approached me and they said, "Hey, are you a city planner, urban planner?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm an urban planner." Just kind of introduce ourselves. But I I thought it was very interesting. Most of their questions about urban planning were about transportation, and some students were asking about city, and then others were asking more of a regional one, which is Kern County. And I asked, where do you reside? Like, where are you traveling from? One mentioned Oil Dell. So they were curious about where can they express their concerns, which I think that's a big, that's an issue where we probably, as a city and county, we can kind of improve, right? Like, really making city councils or planning commissions kind of accessible, and not that it isn't already, but just the information on where they can go and express these concerns, because they had very valid concerns. And yeah, it was just interesting that these students, they were just curious about urban planning, but in transportation, about transportation and specifically.
Yeah, and you know what's funny is that it seems to be something that's kind of universal is that there's never seems to be a stop or anything that's the right place, the right time, or convenient
Hmm.
for whatever we want to do. I think a lot now that I see goes into when you really want to stop somewhere, it's not just about a singular. It's, you know, does it make sense? Does it benefit more than one, person or demographic? And, here's the underlying, does it, and this is the dirty thing about this, I hate to say it, but does it make money? There's a term about transportation, public transportation, that doesn't really get spoken about, but it's a genuine concern, which is revenue miles in ridership. So, do we have enough riders that come on at this location? Does it generate enough revenue? Because a lot of people don't really realize public transportation is funded not only locally, but there's grants that have to really be sought after annually to fund it and to keep it. And and subsequently, as those funds get reduced, it impacts how many times you're going to see that bus come through that bus stop, and if that bus stop even stays at times. So it's a genuine concern, but I think it's also a concern that really has to be understood, that what goes behind it, because there's a lot of nuances to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that, ridership is obviously a big thing. And I think we really saw some of the impact of that from COVID-19. I know that, BART, Bay Area Transit, where I'm from, and, other like larger urban serving public transportation agencies, they really had to scale down. And now we're sort of, out of the pandemic transportation look like. But, I know that ridership isn't exactly where it was, before the pandemic. And I'm kind of maybe speak a little bit to that and sort of, where is it headed? How are we solving some of these problems? Ship equates to, money obviously to make the transportation better or to continue it. You know, how do we yeah, what's the future look like?
Okay, and valid. So COVID-19, obviously, like you said, did really dwarf down the ridership. But then what ended up happening is that COVID-19 was not necessarily, I think, the issue now. The issue now is that people work from home a lot more than what they used to. And,
Hmm.
companies, organizations have found that working remotely is legitimate, it's viable, and, it universally helps reduce costs on them too. So ridership has gone down because we've seen that the economy has found a different way of operating business, which has adversely affected transportation. The need to travel is not as great anymore. The need to travel at all is almost en masse on transportation. Public transportation has been significantly reduced, even to the point where people don't even have to go to the grocery stores anymore. They can join a plan by a big box retailer and have it delivered to them. A
Yeah.
lot of the things that we relied on public transportation for have gone to the wayside now because there are just alternatives that COVID-19 didn't create. They've basically opened eyes onto what can be done. And that's one of the things that I think COVID-19 has had that lasting effect, but it's not COVID-19. It's just the alternatives, businesses, people, everybody had to change their
Yeah.
life. And we've seen those life changes. So now the issue becomes, how do we stimulate it? How do we make riding transportation cool again? Because you still have your core users, which we find are usually going to be the aging
Hmm.
community, or those
Hmm.
that are in a community where they have transportation insecurities. And I'm really light on saying disparaged communities because that's not necessarily the case. We have transportation insecurities in a lot of places. It's just some people are just have homes or apartments where that transportation insecurity is not as prominent as, say, for other communities. And then we do have our disabled communities too, which rely on public transportation, and more so, like for what I do, the rural communities are the ones that
Yeah.
really see the effects of downscaling a route, a fixed route, or changing times or reducing days that we travel for our fixed routes. So those are the impacts, and the uptick is, how do we make it cool? How do we bring it back into light? How do we get people to do it more? So I think that's going to be something that really needs to be taught. It needs to be taught. It needs to be a taught habit. Hey, let's ride our bike. Whatever campaign a municipality or an organization uses, it's something that really needs to have solid efforts to migrate back to.
For sure. And and with that comes like a lot of questions, right? Like security, safety, or yeah, safety. Even in places where it's like hot, are there enough shaded like sidewalks, or the sidewalks, or just that infrastructure itself, is it is it up to date to meet like demand? Like for example, there's streets where it might be 45 miles per hour and the sidewalk is barely 3 feet, and there's a bus stop right there. So like that, that's a car going at 45 miles per hour for a sidewalk that's like 3 feet, and that just unsafe. Like you feel like the air when the car drives by you. So it's that's kind of scary for a
Yeah,
user.
and and when we start talking about those things, and this is on my personal opinion, I think those kind of go back to a general plan for land
Hmm.
use prior, because I think The
Hmm.
general plan, obviously, most places 20, 25 years out. Do we
Hmm.
revisit the transportation corridors? Do we look at the surface roads, arterial roads? Do we reanalyze those? Because when we start talking about what I believe a bus stop that's too close to an arterial road, how long has it been since that transportation plan has
Yeah.
been lined up with the general plan? Have we
Hmm.
really evaluated and seen what the changes are? Because what I'm noticing from what's within my purview here, a lot of them are offset. They are a designated way, especially if it's an arterial road or if we're on a state highway, two-lane state highway. How we're offset because you don't want buses jumping onto one lane of traffic with cars driving 55 miles an hour,
Oh,
those
yeah.
things. But when we start talking about strategic positioning of shelters and bus stops, I really want to say that a transit authority or a transportation district should really revert back to the general plan and see what the outline was for that community
Yeah.
at the time, because I think that may have something to play into it.
Hmm. Um, you
Um,
mentioned.
because
Go ahead, Rogelio.
no, go ahead, Blair. Sorry.
You mentioned earlier, zero emission vehicles, and I was reading today a little bit about the zero emission bus rollout plan and this gradual transition of bus fleet to zero emissions by 2040. I think that obviously that's something that people can stand behind, and it's helping us achieve certain climate goals, but it's not as easy as, bringing in new fleet and retiring the old fleet. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that for our viewers.
Yeah, and you know what, it sounds like there's sufficient time, but 2040 is really not enough time. I think from what I'm seeing is a lot of people don't understand that just building chargers is not as easy as, say, putting up a billboard sign. Putting up chargers is working with your local energy provider and making sure, number one, that there's capacity for the amount of chargers you're going to you need for your facility. So some areas are better off than others. So if there's capacity on the grid for a transit agency somewhere for them to build, then they're going to be able to jump out the gate and start building, and 2040 is realistic for them. For other places, and in somewhat, similar situation for us, the capacity may not be there. And what ends up happening is you're kind of held to the electricity provider to work with them to see what they can do, because sometimes they may not opt to create the capacity. They may want to rearrange the existing facilities to give you the capacity, or you may have to scale down the capacity that you are hoping to have for it. So the logistics behind this is a lot more than what people are really considering. So that's why fuel cells, hydrogen fuel cell technology is something that's coming into really fruition now for mass transportation, because you still have that clean energy, but you're not relying on the capacity of energy, because that energy is created by the hydrogen for the batteries. So to step back, for those who don't know, fuel cell hydrogen is basically the hydrogen creates the energy that's stored within the batteries, and then the battery still powers the vehicle. So it's not straight like gasoline going into a combustion engine. It doesn't the hydrogen doesn't power the vehicle. It's the fuel to create the power within the vehicle, so to speak. So it still equates to 100% zero emission clean energy. But again, if you are going to hold hydrogen or store hydrogen or create your own hydrogen, that becomes an environmental thing now as well. So either way, no matter what route you go, it still takes time. And then one of the big things that we're finding too is for rural transportation, if your geographical locations of your bus stops and your riders are mountainous, high grades versus flatlands, but
Hmm.
battery buses are not going to really be suitable for you. And right now, the fuel cell technology is still very, very new. That while some people have them, there's not access to refueling stations. So right now, there is a big push for some agencies to go for exemptions, diesel fuel exemptions, in the meantime, till that technology actually gets better and then transition. So it's still new. It's still new. It's still difficult, and it still has a lot of growing to do. It's great that a lot of other areas can do it. I think, down in LA, they have those areas where it's feasible, it makes sense, and there was capacity for them, and it's phenomenal. But for a lot of the outer perimeter, a lot of the mountainous areas, a lot of the rural areas, it's taking a lot more work than what people would think and hope.
for sure. Um, Taking a little bit back to post pan or the pandemic, I think one of the, I guess, making or thinking of how can you increase ridership. Sometimes people, like I mentioned, there's certain uh, features in the infrastructure that make it feel unsafe for first of all walkability, um, and just walkability in general. I think the city of Bakersfield developed a on-demand option or service where you kind of call for a ride, kind of like an Uber, and then like they'll take you to like the major transit hubs. I thought that was pretty cool. It, but I just really don't know like pricing, right? But and it's probably cheaper than Uber, but for any thought or any like how can you keep that affordable? Obviously, it's coming to your to your house, but sometimes it can be expensive. Actually, let me look here. I believe 10 to 12 miles is a $10 fare. So that's pretty compared to maybe walking to the bus stop and going to that same transit hub. It might be $3. um you know I just don't know, like I think that's a great option, but also a little pricey for the riders.
Yeah, so I think when you take a Lyft or an Uber, that's a real actualization of what it costs, because the cost is really coming to you as the individual. So if you're going to go that half mile, it's going to be $10. But if you were to use, say, the on-demand service, you're looking at a price point of maybe $3 to $4. Virtually slashed in half, for 30% of what it really would cost. And where that cost savings comes from is most transit agencies search for state and federal level grants, which helps subsidize the cost of
Mm,
riders for riders. And it allows for programs, like I know my agency's offering during the summer free fares for all. And, that's all driven through, subsidized money through grants. So to make it affordable, the money is there. The agency would just have to pursue the grant to subsidize it if that's the route they wanted to go to. Um, but making it affordable is obviously going to take work, and it is there. It just needs to be advertised and marketed a little bit better to get people to catch on. And then hopefully you can continue the reduced fares, or maybe you do something strategically to make it nominal to get it to the price point it needs to be. It really just depends on the mission of the agency themselves and how they
yeah.
want to control their costs. But once we get, I believe, to that zero emission point, the costs at some point should stable and level down, because I know one of the fears, because the vehicles, I'm going to tell you, are just night and day when it comes to price points. When you take a 40-foot bus that would normally cost you, and I know this sounds, I'm not throwing it around, but for like $500,000, that's normal. But when you get something equitable in a zero emission form, we're talking double, $1 million easy. And it can be really, really burdensome and hard, to amass a fleet of those vehicles. So this ramp up
Yeah.
that the state has given us has allowed for that, slow conversion to make it, equitable and feasible for agencies of any size. But continuing the ridership is just going to be a constant. I think it's going to be a somewhat of a constant battle, but I think it can be marketed right and get the ridership up better than what it is at now. I think probably,
Yeah.
if I'm gonna take, just off the top of my head, I think we could probably increase 10 to 15% better with better marketing, kind of make it cool again. I know when I was young, it was cool to ride the bus, hang out with your friends. It was a time to kind of just break away, pass the time till you
Mhm.
got to your destination. I think now people are a little bit more focused. I just want to get from point A to point B and don't leisure ride, so to speak, anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, Rogelio, your question brought up some things for me, and I think quite a bit about micro mobility and the first and last mile. I live about a 17-minute walk or so from transit. And for me, there isn't any ride my bike, but it often is the difference to me between me not taking it and opting to drive my car, just simply because that first mile to transit is a little difficult. And so as a transportation planner, I'm just curious, what kind of considerations are you guys making for micromobility? How is that being implemented? And the future look like it will be kind of more of a synergy between transportation and micromobility, or are we trying to move more towards like active transportation and biking, or all of the above?
So, yeah, yeah. So it's ironic that you say that. Micro transportation, we're actually looking at doing more of it. Currently, I know the services that we offer. We do offer that for medical purposes, for a fixed route, so a rider could get on a fixed route, go to a localized transit center, and then get that micro transit directly to an appointment, and then vice versa.
Mm.
I know that on certain routes, there's constant evaluation on ridership and routes and downsizing, rather using a larger vehicle to more of the vans. Um, and we've actually considered doing that and moving forward with that. So we are going to go down to more of an intimate ridership with, three or four riders, and then extend that beyond the fixed route service as well. So we could be seeing that, while we stop and disconnect at a scheduled stop, if there's individuals that need to go that final mile, they could extend that service beyond. And again, that final mile is very incremental in cost given the subsidies that are there for it. So it could really help out that rider and not impact them, instead of taking that $10 lift to get to that final destination or point. Um, the difficulties for actual final mile to, like, for the rural area is that, final mile for somebody is really like final 5 miles from the bus stop one way, and then 10 miles completely opposite the other way. So from a rural
Yeah.
transit perspective, there's still a lot of work to be done. And then when you consider eventually going away to, say, a battery or fuel cell, that's something else that would just be dealt with as that time came. But we are starting to see a shift to do that micro transit, and actually downsizing vehicles, for climate concerns as well, and it financially
Mm.
makes sense too.
For sure. Um, how can it like? Have you ever encountered like how do you choose like where a stop goes? Um, Also like design. Like have you encountered that? Have you been in talks with, or have you ever been in any in talks that kind of involve that sort of planning or work?
Yeah, and it's actually kind of so much a big deal. But I didn't think it was a big deal. I was like, hey, why don't
Uh-huh.
we just, people want to go stop at this one place, let's go ahead and drop a shelter there and add it to the schedule. But again, this goes to the logistics behind it. It's just not that easy. Number one, depending on where you're going to put a shelter, is it going to be on property public, is it going to be right of way, or is it going to be private property? Is that property owner going to be okay with the shelter being
Yeah.
in front? There's those considerations of location. Then there's the consideration, what does this stop add to the route? I mean, we have drivers, we have to consider, how does that add to their day? Does that extra, you would think that, well, you're already going that route anyway, does that stop really do anything? Well, it does depending on the vehicle. It does depend, do we make it a on-demand stop, meaning that it's if nobody's standing there, we're not going to stop and we just bypass it. Do we make it a fixed stop so that everybody can come there and know that at designated time a bus will be there or around that time? There's that consideration. And is if that driver, how does that add? Because drivers for us don't necessarily just operate one fixed route. They may complete a fixed route and then hub at one location and then drive another route. So there's that component to it. Then there's the feasibility. Does it will it create
Yeah.
more ridership? Perfect example. The only reason I can speak to it because I was approached. There's a facility being constructed. They were saying there was going to be this amount of people coming to the facility on these days, this time of week. Can we implement a new stop there? So then all those things that we discussed go into consideration. Can we put a stop there? Who does it serve? Does it conflict with any other stops that are within there? Do we need to provide an opposite stop? So we have a north stop. Do we need to put one across the street going south as well,
Hmm.
or can we piggyback off of one that's co-located to that location? So stops aren't just as simple as like getting picked up off the street by a Lyft or an Uber. They've got to be methodically thought out because it takes all those prongs that I talked about earlier. Does it make create revenue? Does it make sense? And will it be used effectively?
Yeah.
Yeah. We were talking about this earlier. I forget what year it was, but the city of San Francisco was kind of introducing their bus rapid transit routes, and they were kind of redoing all the bus stops. And I kept thinking to myself, these are nicer, a lot of them have more coverage, but this is probably a really expensive project. And it's now been maybe a decade or so, and those are starting to age. And I know they could be sources of they can people put graffiti on them, or there's some safety concerns around that, and so that's another element to consider. And so I never really thought of it as like infrastructure, but are there funding is there different funding for the bus stop infrastructure? Sort of how does that all fit into transportation planning in terms of like upkeep and maintenance and all that stuff?
Yeah, and there are grants, and that's considered in there. There are grants that give you the ability to work with your infrastructure, revitalize your infrastructure, replace your infrastructure, and shelters are a concern because when you pick out a shelter, you got to consider the area that it's going to be put in, what types of concerns are going to be there, whether it's vandalism, security. Is it facing wind? So do we need wind screens? And it almost sounds like we're overcomplicating and making things, trying to justify that this takes, a collegiate level type of thinking. It really doesn't, but it does take, the faculties to understand that what we take for granted are legitimate concerns. Something as simple as
Yeah.
a windscreen. Oh, turn your back to it. Well, if I'm in a wheelchair and I've only got a 3 by 3
Yeah.
square to work with, turning around to not have the wind hit me in the face is not realistic. Or
Right.
I'm fighting on a bench to sit down because somebody's trying to sleep on it. Those are the realities. Good, bad, or indifferent are not
Yeah.
for me to say, but those are the concerns that you have to think about. And when you go to replace them, your shelters, all of that is valid. We do consider all that. We're going and replacing glass shelters with expanded metal, or we're doing wind resistant type of plexiglass. We're looking at all of those things because not only do we want to give the shelter for somebody to actually shelter themselves, but we also want to make it aesthetically pleasing because we don't want to
Yeah.
degrade
Yeah.
a community. It'd just be horrible. I don't want to put a shelter that looks like a kennel in front of an
Yeah. No.
apartment complex. That's not right. We still want to consider the community. We still want to consider the aesthetics of the shelter, but we also want to consider the functionality of it too. So
Yeah.
and there is money for that too in grants. There's project Clean California was a state grant that really offered a lot of money for that infrastructure for shelters for improvement. So yeah, those are considerations, and that's something that falls under my purview as well. So I mean, I look at different types of shelters. Do we want shingled roof? Do we want flat metal? Solar
Mm,
lighting? Do we want overhead, real time, stop information,
yeah,
map case and stuff like that. So yeah, most definitely those are concerns, and those are things that we address as
Oh,
well.
that's cool.
yeah. That's cool because that's important, right? Looking at how if you want to increase ridership, right, or like how do you make it inviting? How is it not hostile architecture, right? Um, just how do you really invite an individual to to these spaces while they wait? Because I'd like to mention, when I first moved to Bakersfield, I would travel back to Los Angeles to visit my family, but I wouldn't drive just because it was a long week of work. I chose to take the Flixbus, which is almost like a Greyhound but cheaper
Yeah.
version. And they have I guess right at this downtown Bakersfield hub. So it was very easy. I would walk from my apartment. It was about 30 minutes. But honestly, like, and I think this is what, like, whoever's working on these, like, um, how to make transportation more inviting, or how to make transportation cool again. Like, literally, like, when I got off of work on a Friday and I walked to the transit hub to get the Flixbus, I really had to shift my mind, and like, I'm not just going into my car, turning it on and leaving, right? Oh, I can stop at a rest center to use the restroom, or get a snack, right? So it was very different. Like, I knew there can be also, like, the bus is a little slower, a lot more people in there. Um, so, but I would say, like, my experience with Flix, like, with that sort of transportation to from Bakersfield to LA over the Grapevine was very it was um it was good. I have no complaints, like, and it was very easy. I just what I'm trying to say here is, like, I really had to shift my mindset to, like, okay, who's gonna pick me up at the Union Station, or am I gonna take the red line to the Expo line, walk 2 blocks to my parents' house at 12 a.m. So really, you have to schedule, maybe ask your sisters or or whatever family members to pick you up, or so it's really like you really have to plan it out. Like, it legit takes you more planning than just hopping on your car and just kind of going as you go. So um I always thought about, like, how to a lot of people don't want to go through that. So it's but riding going through using the Flixbus over the Grapevine, like, really gave me more time to read books, just relax, not worrying about driving, because that's also, like, it's like being stuck in traffic, right? Like, damn. I mean, when I lived in LA, I traveled to Long Beach. It was about an hour commute, but it's stuck in traffic, right? With no traffic, it's probably like 20 to 25 minutes. So driving to Bakersfield to LA, it's an hour 45. There's no traffic, but you still have to be, like, fully concentrated on the road, making sure it's safe. But these other alternative modes of transportation, or traveling from cities to city, in my case, really did help me kind of alleviate that stress, and just really calm down, wind down, you know what I mean? But just wanted to share that, like, it's
Well, and what you're saying is, and here's what it is: public transportation is, it's difficult because you're not on your schedule; you're on a schedule, and you
right.
have to revolve around that schedule. So
Hmm.
basically, how do you have fun when it's a negative fun scenario? There's nothing fun about this. I'm at
Yeah.
the root of it all, transportation is to get you from where you are to where you need to be, point blank, and back and
Hmm.
forth. So I mean, it is what it is. So then the question becomes, what do you do to distract the rider or make it more appealing? And usually, what it is, it's the ambiance, the environment. How do you make something that's really not cool because it's a pain in the butt? Let's be realistic. I got to be here at 3, and I'm going to get there an hour
Yeah.
earlier than what I need to be. So then the question is, it's becomes a frame of mind.
Yeah.
You have to plan in advance, but once you get planning in advance, just like anything else, it becomes muscle memory. And then what
Hmm.
we need to do,
Hmm.
I think, in transportation as a whole, if I'm not driving, then I'm going to be doing something else which is enjoyable, which today is on your phone, or doing something or work or something. So I mean, there could be campaigns that could really say, hey, let us do the work, you do all the relaxing. I think hotels, airlines do most of it, but again, there's
Yeah.
that perception that the airline serves the purpose that fits the mindset, whereas we need to get into a mindset where the public transportation or mass transit is this way and it allows me to do this while I'm not actually consumed paying attention on the road and driving. So there needs to be a little bit better, and I'm saying this on my own, a little bit better advocacy, because sometimes we don't want to be pulled out of our comfort zone. Hey, I got a car
Yeah.
in my driveway that's going to take me 20 minutes to get to where I need to be. Why would I want to do it in an hour and a half? That makes no sense. But then when you
Yeah.
put it down in that hour and a half, hey, I needed to work on this book that I've been putting off, or I need to finish this paper
Hmm.
for this for work or whatever. There's things that you can be done to really persuade the individual to find the value in that time that you're not driving, and then also the benefits of it while you're at it. Hey, you're not driving, yeah, it's taking a little bit longer, but you're helping reduce the greenhouse gas emission, you're helping reduce vehicle miles traveled, and you're
Yeah.
helping some of that road noise that goes up and down your block all the time that you don't really care to hear at 7 o'clock, at 8 o'clock at night. you know
Hmm.
it's definitely a tricky approach, it's definitely a new mindset, and it's something that we've gotten away from, because when I was younger and back when it cost like a 10 cents or 25 cents to ride the bus, we were all about it. You'd find your cousins, you'd find friends at the bus stop, you'd hang out, and sometimes you'd miss the bus because you're over there messing around, talking or playing games. We kind of need to go
Yeah.
back to that.
I think the only thing that I would add to that, and I
Sure.
love sort of thinking about it a little bit as a like a mindset shift and sort of what's that kind of tipping point where people do sort of think it is cool and want to use it, but you know, for as instances, I think like reliability is one key aspect of it, even if it's going to be a little inconvenient to maybe arrive 45 minutes later, if folks know that it's consistent and that generally it arrives every 15 minutes or whatever it is, and they can count on that. It makes it easier for people to get on board. And so I think for me that's one thing that I always factor in. I've like looked at different cities. I think New York City, the subway system, it is incredibly reliable. And in San Francisco, you've got buses and light rail, and for the most part, it's reliable. Not always, but yeah, I always like to bring that up just because I think that like that's also kind of part of the mind shift for some folks, depending on where they live, just that reliability piece. So
Yeah, and then I think too the personal economics. I mean, if you take into it and you think, hey, I don't think obviously like San Francisco and LA may be a different story, but like for us, a full tank of gas may last you, a week and a half here, because everybody has to
Yeah.
drive a good distance. You know, a fraction of that
yeah,
fuel cost would be a bus pass and last you pretty much all month, for all the simple fact of rearranging some time and coordinating on how you approach your commute is all it takes. So, I mean, it makes economical sense if you are willing to adjust your time, personal time around. And then I think those are the unspoken values and what keeps it going, because we have a lot. It's not just a youth thing. It's not just an aging
No.
thing or a disability thing. It's should be an
yeah,
economic thing, to help save some money
yeah.
if
That is a really
that's
good
what you
point.
want to do.
That's a good point. Yeah. Like the transportation system in Los Angeles, or at least like my mom used my mom used to clean houses, so she was always when he my sister was when my sisters would work, so or I would go to school or work. My dad was at work as well, so no one had the opportunity to like most of the time, like she was riding the bus, so it was she already had a whole like schedule. She already knew what time she needed to wait. Sometimes the bus came in 10 minutes, sometimes it came in 20. So she really gave herself like just her planning out her day and her like, oh, I'd have to go to Santa Monica to clean a house, then go over to Beverly Hills or Cheviot Hills, whatever. She would plan that out. There was an app called Transit that was very useful for her, and it literally, I think it had live trackers on the buses. So I try to use that where I live here, but it's going back to what you were saying, what we're talking about is I can drive to work in 10 minutes instead of taking the bus and it taking me an hour and about an hour and a few minutes. So, as much as I really want to use public transportation, um, it's really inconvenient because I have to wake up an hour earlier. And I mean, that's not the issue. It's literally down the street, but it makes this like very big loop. And I think I asked you about this, Enoch, in person. Like, how's that like? Like, can we just make a bus lane down the main arterial road leading to like downtown? Like, it would make sense, right? But like you're mentioning, there's a lot more factors to it,
Yeah, and
and
like for example, the agency that operates within Bakersfield, that would be something that they would have to negotiate with the city. And again, that
hmm
general plan, that's the big thing in the transportation plan.
hmm
Those are all
hmm
things that need to be considered for development and improvement. Kind of you're talking about like a carpool lane for just buses, like we see down there. That would be something
hmm
with a rapid transit system for with the fixed rapid transit routes. But yeah,
yeah,
it's I don't think it's going to be anything that would just come about within the next year or two. It would take some planning and
yeah,
some deeper thought to the logistics, and it's just one of those burdens. It has to be done, for the greater good down the line.
for sure.
I had one sort of final
Well,
question for you. And, I think one of the big things that we sort of touched on a little bit is funding and the different funding opportunities. There's federal, state, and local funding opportunities. And, these are obviously an advantage, but they do come with some strings attached. And so I was just wondering if maybe you could talk about funding a little bit, your experience with, yeah, maybe some of its benefits and maybe some of the strings that are attached to it and how that can impact, kind of furthering transportation down the road.
Yeah, so most of the funding, it's never really 100%. There's usually leverage or in-kind matching. On average, it could be about 20%. It really just depends on what the expectation is by the state or federal. Um, and some of the things that are required, the biggest thing is the reporting. Whenever you take any grant money from the state or federal, there's always
hmm
the reporting component, and I
hmm
think grants in general, that's what it is. When it comes to vehicles, those the reporting requirements are there. But then there's also for vehicles specifically, there's metrics for useful life measurements and benchmarks. So a bus, even though it may look old, if it hasn't expired by age expectations or mileage expectations, it's still good to go and stay in service. And what's unfortunate is sometimes you may get a vehicle. Not everything is 100% guaranteed to work the way it's supposed to. When you get those lemon vehicles, I hate to say it that way, but they're just drained on maintenance, and it keeps going. It can be tough, and when you operate smaller. Smaller transit agency, sometimes it can really constrict, what vehicles you have, because you always want to have a fixed route wants to have for an internal combustion engine we call ICE. And ICE, you always want to have at least 1 point, I think it's 1.8 vehicles, which really
hmm
equates to two. You're going to have two vehicles for a fixed route. And maintenance, that's to give, at least if one goes down, then you have another, and then you always have the floaters that kind of back up those other routes. So with one thing is with the vehicles, it can become complicated because if you get a vehicle on a grant, you don't outright own it. You have a lien holder. So depending on the municipal, depending if it's state or federal, you're going to have a federal or state lien holder on there. And usually it's the state, because the state will be the filter through for federal funding, and you'll have that lien holder. So then, just like any lien holder on a vehicle, personal vehicle, whatever you do with that vehicle, you have to involve that lien holder, and it has to make, you want to make sure that it falls within the constraints of that grant, because if you deviate out of it, you could find that your agency may become responsible for extra costs for working outside of that contract that you agreed to. So when it comes
Mhm.
to expiring, retiring, or offloading a vehicle, it can be difficult. It can really, really, really be difficult for you. And then also when it comes to the, again, the higher price point of the zero emission vehicles too, you know, that can adds another layer to it too, because then you've got to report why you're getting rid of it if it's still serviceable, and then if you're still holding on to those ICE engines, why haven't you converted? Because that'll come up, because I think it is, 25% of your fleet as we go along has to be converted till we get to 2040. So, yeah, those grants and the money for vehicles do pose issues beyond the reporting. And it's not an issue in a bad way, but it just adds another layer of logistics and, manpower behind the scenes, tracking the vehicle miles. And then obviously you want to make sure that you get the most out of that vehicle when it's been compensated so well, and you don't incur the cost. The agency doesn't incur the cost. So, yeah, it can be tricky right now. What we are facing universally, and this is the one thing I haven't mentioned, is there were three prominent uh, transportation builders, bus builders, 40-foot builders. One of them recently went out of market, so it went down to two. So what we're seeing now
Oh
is the
wow.
wait time. So now
Oh,
wait
wow.
times for your big 35, 40 footers are up to 2 years on builds. Oh
Oh
yeah,
my god.
it's yeah. So and yeah, so so we working with it. Some of and again, a lot of agencies, depending on how they buy in bulk and stuff, they may get priority placement, they may not, but a lot of the smaller agencies work on like a kind of a group. Um, a group contract that they enter into. So a lot of the rural, smaller transportations will all buy into this one contract. What it does, and that gives them better pricing, and it gives them leverage as far as acquiring those vehicles. But yeah, manufacturers right now for your bigger buses are down to two major ones in North America, and there's 2 year waits, so those have to be considered too in
Yeah.
your grant. So your period of performance definitely becomes an issue. You don't want to understate it, because you may not have a bus. So but those are being acknowledged too as well from the state as well, that you may not get the bus, so they're telling you add those 2 extra years on,
So
extend
interesting.
your performance period, and judge it correctly.
For sure. Well, Enoch, we appreciate your time. We really wanted to just have a discussion to, create some food for thought for our listeners and even our, us. Just again, appreciate you sharing your thoughts and, what you do at work. Um, just also just wanted to invite our listeners and people that are probably watching on YouTube or other platforms on Instagram, just let us know what you think. Share your thoughts and comments with us. We're kind of curious as well. I think it's great to talk about these things. It's a sign of community kind of you know being healthy in the sense of people are curious. They want to understand a little about why isn't there a bus stop here. Well, there's a lot of factors to it, and also it can also initiate some sort of like just more curiosity to maybe leading to more solutions and whatnot. So again, appreciate your time. And
Yeah, I mean,
um
I appreciate you
yeah,
so
Blair, did you
much.
want to say anything?
I am gonna keep on talking about making transportation cool because I'm a believer. So I appreciate that you're 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 fighting the good fight.
Yeah,
Yeah. The one thing I do want to share with you guys, and I do want to let you know, I think being a planner was nothing I ever really wanted to do. I want to share this story, and I didn't say it at the beginning because I spent 27 years in telecommunications. I worked for public utility. I did in the military. Um, Planning was nothing that even remotely came to mind when I went to college. I didn't even know it existed. And it was funny. I shared this with Rogelio. I go, well, if I was to talk about being a planner in my household, I'd get laughed at. The only thing we're going to plan is what
Yeah.
we're going to put on the table tomorrow. We're not worried about that right now. And it's such a very underserved
Hmm.
career field because I don't think many people
Hmm.
know about what it is and how vast it is. It's not so constricted. I think the perception most is that you're going to be behind the desk and you're just
Yeah.
going to talk about land use, land use, land use. And it's so much more than that. So if there's anybody considering it, I really
Hmm.
wish that it would be something that would be taught really at the high school level, that it's something there, especially if they're not going to teach it, maybe even a high school group, kind of like you remember HOSA, DECA, FFA, all of those academic clubs. It'd be phenomenal to have a planning club because I think that
Yeah.
if individuals knew that this was an occupation and what it did and how it worked, I think we would see a lot more people. And I think that
Hmm.
translates into what we would see in our communities and our cities. We'd have a lot more activism, a lot more participation. I just think this is one of those under the radar types of occupations that a lot of people I've come into have fallen into. I applaud those of you like you guys who knew from the get go that you guys out the gate you wanted to do this. I came into it at kind of a midlife switch in careers, trying to find something that really had value. And yeah, I have no regrets, and I've enjoyed it. I've bounced around enough to
I love that.
really learn a lot of different things, and I really encourage people to really go out there and find out what it planning really is because it's a hidden gem.
Yup. Thank you, Enoch.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
thank you guys.